I'd like to invite Ethan now to explain what he means by collaborative finance, because that wasn't my phrase. I came up with other things, but it's really, it's a wrap. What?
I have not prepared a wrap.
No. Oh, a wrap. So if you could just explain what you mean by collaborative finance, walk us into Liquidity.
Sure. Thank you, Matt. I'm used to being quite the doomer, so I feel compelled to be more of an optimist here. But yeah, so I mean, so much of monetary economics and economics in general is built around these ideas of competition, of game theory. You know, it seems like ever since statistical physicists discovered the second law of thermodynamics, it has kind of colored everything we do. It's like, oh, well, if the universe is running down, then it's every man or woman for themselves, and you know, get what you can before it all ends. And yet, you know, they failed to take into account that actually, well, living systems are kind of running up, and how do they do that? And you know, there seems to somehow be denying the second law in some kind of way. If you dive into this, you find, you know, actually they're manifestations of the second law, but they, you know, they emerge through this kind of collaborative process in the atoms and in the molecules that are kind of working together to do something. And the thing they might be doing is dissipating energy, right? And so maybe it's making the universe run down even faster, but in the meantime, it's kind of beautiful, right? And so I think we kind of need to take account of that in our in the structures of the economy and society. And so what we want to do is sort of move the framing and the mathematics and the theory from game theory, from the sort of supply and demand and competition, to really network theory, right? I think many of us have this understanding that there's networks, there's networks of credit, networks of obligations, networks of people, networks of trust that underlie everything that's happening in society and the economy, and that isn't being represented in the theory, in the models, but it's intuitively it's there. And you know, many of us look to the sort of mushrooms and the mycelium. We've got Jeff here, who's you know, will be representing the mushroom kingdom all week for us. And you know, and the mushrooms are building these networks and they're connecting everything. And I think many of us kind of feel that in many of our projects, kind of draw from that sort of inspiration and try to build out those networks. And that's really what the collaborative and collaborative finance for us is really about, is recognizing the networks, not just implicitly, but explicitly, right? And really grounding the theory and the design in the existence of these networks of trust and networks of credit and networks of obligation, and seeing what can you do with that? Because the networks expose a lot of potential and possibilities that can't be accessed when you're just reasoning in terms of individualistic, rational agents, right? And there is a kind of, you know, rationality and logic to the networks, but you have to expose the network structures to be able to access that and do something about that. And so for us, that's really what collaborative finance means, because to see the network, you have to collaborate, right? Because if you're just taking an individual perspective, you can't see the network. I mean, you might be able to see your own network and your own connections, right? But that's not really a network. That's just like you know, a little star or something, right? But it takes many stars, and it takes sort of collaborating to see them all, right? And so, you know, in what we're working on, it's literally, well, you have to collaborate to expose the network of obligations. You might know your own obligations, who you owe. This is the game we're going to play, but you actually have to work together to see, well, who does everyone else owe? And if you owe people that owe you, well, then that makes new kinds of things possible that benefit all of you, right? But you really have to collaborate to expose those opportunities and take advantage of them. And ironically, it's something the banks and the financial institutions are doing all the time. They get together and they collaborate. They build these little clubs, and you know, they call them clearinghouses or you know, central banks or whatever, and they work together amongst themselves, and they expose their networks of obligations, and they rescue each other, and they're always bailing each other out and doing things about this, right? And those mechanisms aren't accessible to everyone else for some reason, right? But they could be. And so for us, that's really what collaborative finance is: exposing the network of credit, the networks of trust that exist between all of us, so that we can you know, we can leverage the same mechanisms, the same powers that the banks and the financial institutions are leveraging. And we feel this is really what the sort of blockchain revolution has been promising, but also missing, right? It's been promising this like open financial tooling for everyone, and yet it's all about trustless settlement, right? It's missing the whole essence of the matter, which is that we need to build trust and do this kind of clearing. You know, thank you. So you'll hear much more about that tomorrow, but I'll pass it back to All right. So how'd everyone do? Most of you cleared all your debt. So it turns out the game was designed so that you could clear everything. I think one group struggled because they had the highest concentration of monetary expertise, and so it turns out the more you know about money, the harder this is. Now, we played this game with a bunch of crypto people in Austin about a month ago, and so as we all know, these people know absolutely nothing about money, and they finished the game very quickly. So I think we could all be a little more humble. No. But it's funny that everyone tries to overcomplicate it. But so the game was obviously designed so that you could clear all the debt. In practice, the payments graph isn't always balanced. The reason we call this the art of exchange is because these bankers back in the 16th century or so, they considered it their art to balance the payments graph. Right, so they were engaging in a practice of bills of exchange where they would basically advance money, coins to people. In, let's say, Lyon, in exchange for a bill that they could then send to their correspondent in Antwerp and cash in at the next fair from someone else, right? And so they're out money in Lyon, and they're going to pick up money in Antwerp, but that doesn't really help them because they don't know if they've made a profit. They gave up cash in one place, they're going to get some other cash in another place. How do they calculate their profit? And so it turned out the best way for them to do that was to make sure that they have a re-exchange, something coming back the other way, right? So that there's another exchange coming back, and that is what they considered their art, making sure that they balanced the graph so that for every amount going out here, they had an amount coming back there, so that they could actually denominate their profit and be sure that they made money. And it turns out there's an amazing book, which there's actually a copy of in the other room, called Public Money, Private Currency, The Challenge of the 16th Century. It turns out the exchange bankers at that time, they were basically running a private international banking system where they coordinated on setting the exchange rates so that there was a structural hierarchy of exchange rate. The rates were always higher in Lyon than they were elsewhere, which made sure that when they did this exchange and re-exchange, they were guaranteed to profit. And so they were incentivized to balance the payments graph, not only did it mean they didn't have to bring cash to the fair to settle everything, but they guarantee their profit by making sure the graph was balanced. So this was their art. They called it exchange per arte, and so we made a game of it, the art of exchange. Now this balanced payments graph basically collapsed by the end of the 16th century, and the reasons why are very interesting and led to a world where there was a permanent imbalance entrenched into the system, which is the imbalance of the states. Right. So before this time, from the 16th century and prior, states had to maintain a balanced treasury. It was only in times of emergency that they built up debts to fight off wars. And starting at the end of the 16th century, with the Genoese essentially funding Spain fighting its war in the Netherlands, they started to entrench this permanent imbalance in the payments graph, and we have never recovered from that. So the payments graph remains imbalanced today. Bretton Woods was all about a structural imbalance in the payments graph in favor of America, but it's been there forever. And I think what all of us are trying to do is sort of intuitively, and this is what we want to make explicit with the network science, is rebalance the graph, right? And so it's not so much about what is the reserve currency and should it be dollars or Bitcoin or some collection of BRICS currencies. It's moving away from the concept of a reserve currency altogether, because reserve currencies come from this notion of, well, you need this reserve to manage your imbalances. The whole point is to get rid of the imbalances and balance the graph. But of course, we don't want to be too naive. Balancing is a problem of power and production, right? The imbalance reflects these patterns of power and production, and whoever has the power can sort of maintain these imbalances. And this is why what I think many of us are trying to do is sort of find a way to go bottom up and empower businesses and communities to balance their own graphs and have that sort of lead up and percolate up to the international level. And so the way I think about sort of what we're trying to do is succeed where Keynes failed, right? So in 1944 or earlier at the Bretton Woods conference, Keynes was trying to tell everyone, hey guys, we don't need a reserve currency. We need to balance the payments graph, right? The Bancor proposal was all about balance. It was setting up a way to ensure that no one went into surplus or deficit for too long. Everything stayed balanced. And of course, the Americans told him to go fuck himself and said America's going to be the reserve currency and we're going to have a permanent imbalance. And so let's try to do it sort of from the bottom up, balance the payments graph from the bottom up. And, if we can be, I don't know if optimism is allowed here, but I don't think Matt's in the room, so maybe we can get away with it. Maybe we'll succeed where Keynes failed. So hope you learned a little something and had some fun and got to know each other a bit playing the game. And you'll hear a lot more about sort of where we're going with all this tomorrow and how other things might be able to fit together. But that's it for now. And I'll turn it over to Julio.